Brice Sensabaugh is an awesome scorer who's projected as a late first-round pick. This is Floor and Ceiling. Let's break him down. Brice Sensabaugh out of Ohio State was one of the best scorers in college basketball this season. As a freshman, he scored 16 points per game on near 59% true shooting. All the while, Sensabaugh had a crazy high 32% usage rate. His NBA comparison has to be Cam Thomas, who similarly shouldered a heavy load at LSU, but with questions over whether he could make others better, play more than one role, and defend up to par. Those are similar improvement areas for Sensabaugh as we'll get into, but let's start with what he's best at. Sensabaugh is a master from the mid-range. At 6'6" and with long arms and these mechanics where he fades away almost every time, Brice can get into this shot pretty much whenever. 43% of his total shots were two-point jumpers this year, and Sensabaugh made half of them, which is pretty insane. The Ohio State scorer was creating these shots for himself most of the time, which is even more impressive. So he was both shooting and converting on high volume. There's little doubt in my mind that Sensabaugh has awesome touch on his shot. On his mid-range too, Sensabaugh is really skilled at these face-up types of situations where he's looking right at the rim. He does a lot of his work off of 2 feet, but Brice is also crafty with how he uses his strength and big body to bump his defender off his spot. That way, he creates enough separation to then rise into his pull-up. More than finesse, I really think power is the word to describe Sensabaugh's scoring. He's so dangerous off of 2-foot jump stops and powerful drives because he's able to decelerate and shoot with ease from anywhere inside the 3-point line. Sensabaugh can also take his man into the post. He's not some great athlete like we'll dive into, but he is strong and wide at around 235 pounds. Certainly he can take advantage of smaller guards, but overall, Brice can move his defender to get to where he wants, and it's his touch, high set point, and fall away on his turnaround that makes him difficult to stop. Looking ahead, I'll want to see more of this type of stuff where Sensabaugh attacks a closeout using his pull-up. I think this should be easy for him since everything is there for this shot to be a consistent make. And I'm also curious to see if he can handle more reps using ball screens to then get into his jumper, rather than mostly resorting to isolations and post-ups. However, while this pull-up too can be lethal for Sensabaugh, and I'm very high on it as a tool for playoff type games in particular, he's also overly reliant on it. 43% of his total shots were 2-point jumpers, which is a shot diet that very few players get in the NBA on high volume. Simply put, there's no way for this to carry over. Sensabaugh is not going to be the go-to guy on his team, especially early on, I think. So he'll have to adjust and conform his game to a lesser role. We don't know how that looks yet, but the indicators at Ohio State were that Sensabaugh was largely comfortable when the ball was in his hands. Otherwise, he didn't show much, which is partly why, despite averaging more than 16 points per game, Sensabaugh played less than 60% of his team's total minutes. The Ohio State prospect has great touch and instincts as a scorer, but he can freeze out his teammates and monopolize the offense. Going back to that Cam Thomas comparison, mid-range twos made up even more of Brice's shot diet, to give you an idea. And it's also clear that even though Sensabaugh can kind of get to this shot whenever, part of the reason that he has to get to this shot so much is because he cannot get all the way to the rim. Brice plays pretty under control, so he doesn't necessarily give off this impression, but he's having to pull up from in between so often because he's just unable to access deeper territory in the paint. Sensabaugh took very few shots at the rim, just about 2 in 10 of his shots came here. But it's not just that though. It's almost the opposite story as from 2, where Sensabaugh takes and makes a lot of shots. Closer to the basket, his conversion drops to below 50% if we take away his dunks, which he only had 9 of all year. Brice is definitely a high quality scorer, but he's not exactly working at all 3 levels, which caps his potential now and later. I would also expect these finishing woes to be amplified in the NBA. Sensabaugh is very much a below the rim athlete. He plays off of 2 feet a lot, which he will have to diversify, but also he's probably always going to be limited here. There's some room for athletic improvement, but Sensabaugh's first step and explosiveness aren't really factors here. Instead, he'll have to learn to pace himself better, use screens more often, and understand how to use his length to finish from tough angles. Something he's already flashed is this floater, which is nice. It's this type of in-between offense that Brice is going to need, since I think he's only going to be able to improve his creation at the rim so much. Also, Sensabaugh cannot always resort to his pull-up or fadeaway, so it will benefit him to have plenty of tools from the mid-range. The ways that he gets to the rim are also going to have to change slightly. Instead of ISOs, I'm looking for him to be quicker attacking off the catch. And like with his jumper, I want to see him grow even more comfortable using screens to create for himself, since, let's face it, that is what Sensabaugh looks to do most of the time. Diving out to the 3-point line, everything is pretty encouraging right now. Really, he's a good to great scorer from everywhere except the basket, so this carries over to the perimeter. Sensabaugh made a little over 40% of his triples as a freshman at Ohio State, and there is a difference here compared to his 2-point scoring. Brice mostly created those makes from the midi for himself, but that's not the case from 3, where from deep, Sensabaugh can play with, I think, a more scalable shot diet. Out of his 60 makes, 51 were assisted, which gives me hope that Sensabaugh can one day play a more contained role on offense. Still, he'll really have to cut down on his touches and 2s. Technically speaking, I have no concerns. Sensabaugh has textbook mechanics and feathery touch, but if one day he can create for himself a little bit more from deep, then almost he becomes the complete pull-up shooter. At this juncture, he's more simplistic from 3, whereas Brice might chain together a whole bunch of moves from 2, he's quicker from range, playing out of 1 or 2 dribbles, or a step back. All of this is encouraging to see, and I think that in the summer league, we might see some more reps from him as a self-creator from 3. My biggest question is just how Sensabaugh adapts to what an NBA team needs from him. This is not a direct comparison, but truly I feel like there are lots of parallels between Sensabaugh and Cam Thomas, both in college and then later heading into the draft. Thomas got to the rim even less than Sensabaugh, but he took even more 3s and he was comparable from the mid-range while on similar efficiency. Thomas ended up as the 27th pick in 2021, and he's had some great games for the Brooklyn Nets in the NBA, including some 40 pieces, but he's really struggled for playing time, largely because Cam's scoring doesn't come within his team's offense. I'm concerned that a similar situation could play out with Sensabaugh. He really struggles at the rim, barely gets to the free throw line, and he has a little seen shot diet for prospects, even if he is efficient. And then, much like Thomas, the playmaking is a major concern. Sensabaugh is great at generating things for himself, but NBA teams are still wondering whether he improves others around him as well. As a freshman, Sensabaugh only had 38 assists in 33 games. That's even less than Thomas. It is on less minutes, but still. Plainly put, Sensabaugh looks to score and almost never to pass. He's concerned with getting his own bucket, which can work within certain contexts or off the bench, but then a team has to take that into account, and that can put a cap on the number of organizations that prioritize Sensabaugh. Brice has very little feel for which windows are open on the floor, he doesn't play with his head up often enough, and there's a good chance that NBA defenses are going to find him predictable. In all fairness, he didn't turn the ball over a lot relative to how much he had it in his hands. Sensabaugh averaged 2 turnovers per game, which is somewhat encouraging, I guess, but it also shows that he's mostly just taking his own pull-ups. Looking ahead, it boils down to whether Sensabaugh ever understands how to leverage his scoring into passing. Right now, he doesn't do that. There were some flashes this year, but very few ones that I can willingly buy into in a major way. Brice Sensabaugh is a very limited defender right now, both on and off the ball. Major improvement is going to be needed here, and in fact, this is where he is least prepared for the NBA. There are questions down the other end. For instance, how does Sensabaugh fit within an offense that's not geared to him? Can Brice play out of much fewer touches? But I think you can get around those because of how talented he is as a scorer. However, even if a team is able to get to a point where Sensabaugh is scoring double digits in a sustainable way for the entire squad, right now he would be giving away those same points that he scores on defense. Sensabaugh is a mess on this side of the floor. He's unable to keep attackers in front of him, be it his size, smaller, or bigger. He is constantly falling asleep away from the ball and is unaware to what is going on around him. And he doesn't have the athletic tools or motor to really fall back on in terms of recovery. Brice was a solid rebounder statistically for Ohio State, but that's only because he was allowed to push off misses. Otherwise, his defensive playmaking was close to non-existent. In theory, at 6'6" and with long arms, Sensabaugh should be able to get at least some stops. But he puts in no effort on this side of the ball, and at Ohio State, this actually got him benched quite a bit. It goes back to how he played less than 60% of his team's total minutes, while still being probably the best scorer on his squad. The 19-year-old cannot be counted on positionally or to execute team concepts. He's neither disciplined nor seemingly motivated, and he's not technically sound either. The latter part is very apparent from Sensabaugh's closeouts in particular. He was incredibly careless in this department, which is really reflective of his entire defensive efforts. And I think that there's no point or really a way to truly dissect his defense because there's very little to dive into. It's more so a very broad improvement that has to take place, starting with effort first and foremost, continuing into technique, and ideally just ending in Sensabaugh being usable on this end, because that might be all you can aspire for. Of all the prospects in this draft, I think that Brice Sensabaugh is definitely one of the most natural and one of the most pure scorers. But I think much like Cam Thomas, even if they are not the same player, the key for Sensabaugh is going to be two things. Number one, diversifying his shot selection a little bit more. In his case, I think it's too mid-range heavy. And then he'll just have to prove that his scoring can mesh within the needs of a team offense. As always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like. Make sure to leave a comment telling me what you think of Brice Sensabaugh. And if you enjoyed the video, if you want to watch more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Take care, and I'll catch you guys next time.